This is a 1994 Audi RS2 Avant. And in fact, it's my 1994 Audi RS2 Avant. I bought this car, I imported it to the United States, I spent more than $70,000 on a 25-year-old Audi station wagon. And today I'm gonna review this car and show you around my dream car, the greatest fast station wagon ever made. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. If you're looking to sell a cool car from the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. You'll get the most views, the most traffic, and the most bids. If you're looking to buy a cool modern car, Cars and Bids has amazing inventory with daily auctions of very special cars. Check out Cars and Bids at carsandbids.com. So let's get started with a little history. Back in the 1990s, the car industry was very different than it is today. Back then, Audi was a mediocre, third-rate luxury car brand struggling to gain traction against BMW and Mercedes, who were the big German luxury players. Audi was desperate to change that, to improve its reputation, and they thought more high-performance cars would help. But even though Audi was known for its rally racing success, they didn't really have the performance car credibility to take on the emerging BMW M division and big engine Mercedes-Benz models of the time. So they turned to Porsche, who had a reputation for performance and a desperate need for money. Audi came to Porsche and they said, "Hey Porsche, we want to partner with you to build a high-performance Audi." Porsche said, "Okay, let's do it." So they did. And the result is the RS2. This is an Audi, but it was heavily upgraded by Porsche, and it was manufactured by Porsche in Porsche's factory. And it's a really important car for Audi. This is the first ever Audi RS car. The RS3, the RS4, the RS6 that you all know, it started right here. This is also the very first high-performance station wagon. The RS6 Avant, the AMG Wagon, the Cadillac CTS V-Wagon, the M5 Touring, it also started right here. And now I have one. This car was never sold in North America, and I believe this is the first one in California. This is a car I've wanted for more than a decade, and it has finally happened. And today I'm going to show you all the quirks and features of the RS2 and explain why I love this car so much. And of course, then I'll drive it and give it a Doug score. Let's get started. And by the way, welcome to Dougsember. This is the best month of the year, and it's starting off great. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of my RS2 by discussing the Porsche involvement in this car. Now, this is an Audi, but like I said, Porsche upgraded this car for Audi, and Porsche actually built it in a Porsche factory. And there is evidence of that all throughout the car, starting with the brakes. These brakes are from a Porsche 968 Club Sport. These are not Audi brakes, and you can see that it says Porsche on the brake caliper itself, evidence of Porsche's involvement. People have seen this and asked me, "Why did you put Porsche on your Audi brake caliper?" I didn't. This car has Porsche brakes that were put on by Porsche. And there's a lot more than that. The rear view mirrors are from a 911, the 964 911 being made at the time. The RS2 shares the mirrors, and they look totally out of place. This is like a boxy, straight edge car, and then it has these aerodynamic mirrors that make no sense. Well, that's because they came from the 911. And same deal with the wheels. These are not Audi wheels. These are from the Porsche 911 Turbo at the time, not aftermarket, put on by the factory Porsche wheels on an Audi with Audi center caps. And that means these wheels have a Porsche bolt pattern, so you can swap out for other Porsche wheels, which wasn't true of any other Audi at the time. Pretty cool, because it was built by Porsche. And by the way, 911 Turbo wheels, but the 911 Turbo is wider in the back with wider wheels, so the RS2 actually has 4 911 Turbo front wheels. It has front wheels in the front and front wheels in the back, all the same size, unlike the 911 Turbo, a wonderful little tidbit. And the Porsche-ness goes further than that. These fog lights in the front bumper are straight out of the 911 Turbo at the time. Same fog lights, same part number, they just modified the Audi bumper to be able to fit them. But probably the coolest exterior sign of Porsche's involvement in this car is the badge, this weird little shaped badge in the grille. Upper left you have the Audi logo, then on the right RS2, and then on the bottom you have the Porsche script, tying in Audi and Porsche in one badge. Same deal on the tailgate, you also have this Audi RS2 Porsche badge in one. Audi ended up using this badge design for their S and RS models later, but of course only the RS2 had Porsche at the bottom. But probably the coolest Porsche tie-in of all in this car is under the hood, where you can see it says "Powered by Porsche" stamped into the engine. That is factory stock, it's how it came, powered by Porsche. There is no Audi logo on this engine at all. Instead, you just have "Powered by Porsche" there to remind you who tuned this car. That is pretty cool. And just as cool is the VIN plate at the back of the engine on the firewall, where it lists the manufacturer as Audi Porsche RS2. Not just Audi RS2, it has both listed because of their respective contributions to this car. And in fact, in some countries, you have to register these as Audi Porsche RS2, not just Audi RS2, because that is the official manufacturer name as listed here on this VIN plate. That's pretty neat. So aside from a bunch of logos, you might be wondering, what exactly was Porsche's involvement with this car? Well, it was pretty substantial, as you can imagine from how Porsche this is. They did the brakes, like I showed you, from the 968 Club Sport. They also did the suspension for this car, tuned to make it more sporty, handle better than your standard Audi models of the day. Of course, they also made various cosmetic upgrades, as I've shown you, like the wheels and the front fog lights, but the biggest stuff that Porsche did was under the hood, by far. Porsche added a larger turbocharger to this car, a larger intercooler, a different ECU, and several other items under the hood, like a new camshaft to give it far more power, far better performance, and to really add performance credibility to this car, which is what Audi thought they were lacking. The result was 315 horsepower, a huge number back then, especially for a station wagon. Nothing else had come close. And 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds. In fact, this car came out in '94. Audi didn't make something faster 0 to 60 for a decade. It took them that long to beat the fabled RS2. This car was faster than the Ferrari 348 that was out at the time. Of course, that made sense because it was the V8 powered Ferrari that was ending its production run. But this car was also faster than the Ferrari 456, which was the V12 powered Ferrari that was just starting its production run. And to have that in a station wagon at the time, it was absolutely insane. By the way, Porsche's other contribution to this car, they suggested the RS nameplate to Audi. Porsche had used it on a couple of other models, the 73 Carrera RS, very famous, and they said, hey Audi, you might want to try this. It's a fast sounding name. So Audi named it the RS2, and that kicked off the high-performance RS line of cars from Audi. It all started right here with a Porsche suggestion. So with all this Porsche stuff on the car, you might be wondering why? Why did Porsche, fabled German sports car manufacturer of high-end, really fast cars, bother to help out stupid Audi with a station wagon? Well, from Audi's side, Porsche's involvement was really important. A lot of the print articles about this car say that Audi turned to Porsche because Audi didn't have the expertise to build a car like this. That isn't true. Audi was building high-performance cars. They had the Quattro, the Sport Quattro. They were very successful at rally racing throughout the 80s. But what they didn't have was the credibility as a brand to build a serious performance car. People today don't realize, or they forget, but Audi in the early 90s was not at the BMW Mercedes competitive level. Instead, it was more like Saab, a mediocre luxury brand with a weird product lineup, and it was very much a second choice. So if Audi wanted to come with a performance brand, it made sense to link up with Porsche, who had a strong reputation. Okay, so then your question is, well, what did Porsche get out of it? And the answer is money. It really needed money. A lot of newer Porsche enthusiasts who buy GT3 RSs just to brag about the parking brake stitching don't realize that back in the late 80s and early 90s, Porsche was in a rough spot, near bankruptcy, and they just needed money badly. And so they built the 500e for Mercedes-Benz, and then they built the RS2 for Audi. And this car was an obvious choice for Porsche because they already had experience building turbocharged all-wheel drive performance cars since they had made the 959 only a few years earlier. There weren't that many turbo all-wheel drive fast cars at the time, but Porsche had done one, so they figured, well, we could do an Audi Wagon. And Porsche's desperate need for money helps to explain all of the Porsche logos on the outside of this car. Today, a strong brand like Porsche would never allow another automaker to use its logos or its script on their product. The idea of it is laughable, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, Porsche, well, you did the money. So Audi probably came to them and they said, can we use your logo? And Porsche said, no. And Audi said, we'll give you $4 million. And Porsche said, done. Done deal. We'll take it. And so that's why we have an Audi Wagon with more Porsche logos than Audi logos. And just a couple other quick notes about the Porsche Audi tie-in, and then I'll move on to the rest of the quirks and features. For one, this car was not built on the same production line as the 911 and other Porsche models. Instead, it was built in the same campus in Zuffenhausen in Stuttgart, where Porsche builds its cars, but it was a few buildings over from the 911 line in the same facility where Porsche built the 911. As for production, the RS2 was built from early 94 till near the end of 95, about 18 months total, and Porsche built around 2,900 units of this car. That's the total production for the RS2. Now, all this Porsche involvement and performance upgrades meant that this car was expensive. Back when it was new, it cost the equivalent of $120,000 for an Audi Wagon, but it was a big deal because it was the first high-performance all-wheel drive practical car. And when I drive this, I have visions of being in Switzerland in the early 90s, driving my family to a ski trip at 100 miles an hour in the snow, passing BMW M5 Tourings with snow chains on and their hazard lights, or Mercedes 500Es stuck spinning their wheels in the snow. This thing would pass them all, and it must have been pretty boss to have that back then. But anyway, on to the rest of this car's quirks and features, starting in the back with this massive light bar going across the entire rear of the car. Who says light bars are a modern trend? This one, though, is especially ridiculous because it pretty much doesn't function. Everything in the middle has no function at all. Check this out. You have on the sides the brake lights, as you can see, and also the turn signals, but they're over on the body of the car. They're not even on the light bar. On the bar itself, you have only the reverse lights sort of on the sides, and then the rear fog light. Everything else is completely unused space, just excess light bar in this car, which is kind of ridiculous looking. In fact, the light bar is so massive that they have integrated the tailgate handle into the light bar, and when you open up the tailgate, you actually lift up some of the light bar reflector in back. The handle is integrated into the light bar, and so is the keyhole back here. It's actually kind of clever. The keyhole was integrated specifically into the reverse light, so the colors sort of matched, and it sort of concealed the keyhole a little bit, and it made the rear end look a little cleaner. Nice idea. And next up, moving on to the cargo area back here, you have your usual wagon accoutrement that you might expect, like, for example, a cargo cover that you can roll into place or that you can retract if you want. That may not seem like a big deal, but back in the early 90s, not too many wagons had it, but this one does. You also have the ability to fold down the back seats. You can fold up the bottom part and then fold the seat back so it's flat, or you can just fold the seat back separately if you want to do it a little quicker. But either way, it gives you the opportunity to put a lot more large, bulky cargo in the back, which is nice since this is ultimately a station wagon. But even though it's relatively large back here, it certainly isn't huge. The RS2 was based on the Audi 80, which is the car that eventually evolved into the A4. And although the A4 has grown over the years, it's still not exactly a large car, and that was especially true 25 years ago. This was definitely a compact car on the size of maybe a BMW E30, a little bit bigger than that, and so big cargo area, but not a huge one. And that size thing is further proven when you climb into the back seat. You quickly discover there's not all that much room back here. I fit back here, but just barely. My head is right up against the ceiling, my knees are right up against the front passenger seat. It is quite a tight fit. But again, remember, when you think about all-wheel drive performance cars from this era, you had the Lancia Delta Integrale, which had an even smaller back seat. You had the Ford Escort Cosworth and the Porsche 911 911 Turbo, which were two-door cars, so this, by comparison, was excessively practical. A very excellent family car, even though it is quite tight in the back. Now, aside from the sizing and the fact that the seats fold down, there's nothing really interesting in the back seat of this car. Very bare bones, very basic. You were just supposed to sit back here and be quiet while Dad drove the family to the ski trip. That was the point of the back seats. There is one interesting item, though, worth pointing out, and that is the window switch. You can see right now the headlights are on, so the rear window switch is illuminated, so you know where it is to roll down your window. But if the driver presses the window lockout on the driver's door panel, which disables passengers from rolling up or down their windows, that light turns off because the window is no longer available, and so the light isn't on until the driver pushes the button again, and then the light turns back on, letting you know that now you're free to roll down your window again. That's a pretty cool touch. I don't think I've seen that one before. And next up, we move up front in the RS2, and I want to point out that this car doesn't have the RS2's coolest interior feature, which was a blue interior. The RS2 was offered a blue exterior, obviously, but you could also get this blue suede in the middle of the seats and the same material on the door panels, sort of a two-tone black and blue. This is by far the most sought-after RS2 interior now, but it's exceptionally difficult to find. The black seats in this car will have to do, and do they will. They're actually in really nice shape. I was considering reupholstering them with blue centers, but I decided against it because they're just too nice for now to do that to. This is the original interior. But anyway, front seat quirks and features. Starting in the middle, manual transmission. All RS2 models had a manual, and it was a 6-speed manual, which was a pretty big deal in '94. A lot of cars, even performance cars, still had a 5-speed. Also in the center, you can see the differential lock. You press this button and it locks the diff for especially tricky, snowy, all-weather situations, harkening back to Audi's days as a rally car champion. As for the climate vents in this car, they're rather interesting. They're in an arrangement where you have 2 vents over on the left side, the driver's side, you have 2 vents over on the right side, the passenger side, and then you have 2 vents in the middle. So they're 2, 2, 2, except the middle has 3 vents in it, doesn't it? Well, no, that's not true. There are 2 outer vents. The middle one is a dummy. It's actually the boost gauge. And yes, this is the factory boost gauge location. This was not added aftermarket. We didn't convert a climate control vent for it. This is where Audi put the boost gauge on a dummy center climate control vent in the middle. And speaking of the middle, here's another interesting item. The radio, this is the factory unit, and it operates independently of the car. You can turn it on, run the radio without the car being on at all, and then you can turn it off. So I guess if you're just sitting in your car, eating lunch or waiting for someone, whatever, you could run the radio without having the engine or the accessories on, which is a nice touch, but kind of strange. Also kind of strange in the center control stack is the controls for the heated seats. They're operated by this dial, and there are 6 different stages of heated seats that you can turn on. Just in case stage 4 isn't warm enough, you can move it up to stage 5, but don't go to 6. No, that's too high. I can't imagine how sensitive Audi thought people's butts and backsides were, but 6-stage heated seating is the result. Next up, moving over to the driver's area, this car has a rather odd headlight switch. Instead of a little dial on the left side of the dashboard like most cars, it has a stalk coming off the steering column next to the turn signal stalk, but smaller, and that's how you turn on the headlights. You put someone in this car, ask them to turn on the lights, they never figure it out, ever. It's a very bizarre functionality, but that's how it was. And the A4 used that too when it first came out. Another interesting function in this area is in the gauge cluster, where you have a tiny little screen that lets you know various different pieces of car information. This screen will tell you your fuel economy, your range left to empty, your average speed. Not much, but that little screen is where it all started. And of course, now we have giant infotainment screens that tell us all sorts of stuff. Screens like that were the very beginning of the infotainment system explosion, if only we had known back then. And next up, back outside the RS2, there's a little more to cover with the engine, but first, I want to talk about something I absolutely love, which is the latch to open up the hood. When you unlatch it from the inside, the front latch pops out of one of the Audi rings. And that's where it comes from. Audis did this for a long time. The latch was hidden in the ring. They don't do it anymore, but it was cool while it lasted. But anyway, you pull the little Audi ring latch, you open up the hood, and then you can see the engine. Now, despite all the Porsche upgrades, the engine in this car was Audi's 2.22-liter turbocharged 5-cylinder. It was used in various other Audi performance cars from this era, but obviously none anywhere near as much power because they didn't have all of the Porsche upgrades as the RS2. But it's Audi's engine to start, even though it is powered by Porsche. And next up, I want to discuss another important attribute of the RS2, and that would be its styling. I love how this car looks. Now, like I said, it was based on the Audi RS2 Avant, pretty simple Audi station wagon from the time, but it was upgraded to look cooler, to look more aggressive, but it wasn't over-upgraded. It's a very subtle car that has a business-like, purposeful, station wagon-y look without tipping off too much that it's something really special. Ultimately, this is just a station wagon with a roof rack, and by far the most powerful station wagon in the world at the time. But you didn't know that unless you were racing it. And that's the coolest thing about how Germans made performance cars in the 90s and the early 2000s. It was no show, all go. You didn't know what you were up against until you were getting beaten by it. And I love that about this car. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about this car, this particular one. Since it's mine, I wanted to give you a little bit of its backstory and then explain why I wanted it so much, why I wanted this car. So let's start there, why I wanted it. If you follow along with my stuff, you know I'm a big fan of high performance wagons. I have owned 2 different Mercedes AMG station wagons, and I had a Cadillac CTS V-Wagon. But I've always loved this as sort of the original high performance station wagon, which it basically is. Volvo was also making fast wagons at this time, but they never went above about 222 horsepower. This thing had 315. It was totally blew everything else out of the water, and I consider this the original high-performance wagon. So it made sense that a fast wagon fan like me would want it. But I only wanted blue. This blue color is very important to me because I buy all of my cars in the color from the original press photos, the brochures, the posters they made, and for this car, of course, it was blue. Now, this color on this car was called RS Blue because it was only offered on this car, the RS model. But when Audi expanded the availability of this color to other models in its range, they changed the name to Nogaro Blue, which is, of course, the color we all know, the most famous Audi color of all time, and it started right here. This was the very first car that had it. Now, if you're looking for an RS2, you know that finding a blue one is both difficult and far more expensive than finding one in another color. And this car was never sold in North America, and I figure there's maybe 20 or 30 of these that have made their way here that have been imported, and maybe 8 to 10 are blue. Now, I didn't want to import a car from overseas. It's quite a process, a lot of headache, a lot of stress. I just didn't want to do it. So the options for an RS2 that I would consider buying were pretty limited to a handful of blue cars that were in North America. Fortunately, I got connected to the seller of this car, who's on Instagram as Blau RS2, which is, I guess, now a bit of an outdated Instagram name since he sold me his Blau RS2, but I found out that he was interested in selling his car. His RS2, this car, is kind of an important one in the history of RS2s imported to North America because it was the first one ever imported. The seller of this car lives up in Canada, and up there you can import a car after it's 15 years old, and he imported this one from Japan right when it turned 15. So this car spent the first part of its life in Japan, which is the best place to buy imported cars from because the Japanese keep cars very well as they age in excellent shape. And then the seller, the guy I bought it from, brought it to Canada, and he had it up there for 10 years. And he was meticulous about his ownership with this car. It was perfect. Now, here's a cool tidbit. I have only seen 2 RS2s ever in my entire life. One was last summer, 2019, in London. I saw a blue one on the street, and that's the car that convinced me, okay, it's time to actually take the plunge and buy one of these. I was so excited, I ran after it like a child. It was so cool. The other RS2 I've seen was this car. Back in 2016, years ago at Pebble Beach, this was the first RS2 I ever saw. The owner had brought it down from Canada, and there it was, the first time I ever laid eyes on an RS2. and now I own it. But anyway, the seller, Blau RS2, he and I negotiated a deal privately. This car was never listed for sale. We privately came to a number, agreed to it, and then I bought the car, sent him the funds, and I imported the car from Canada to the United States. Yes, during COVID, the borders are open for commercial activity like this, bringing across purchased items and selling goods. So I brought this over and then registered and titled it in the United States, making it one of just a handful of RS2s that are legal, since these are now 25 years old and legal to import to the United States. Now, as you can imagine, the hardest part of owning this car has already been servicing. Now, I bought this car from the previous owner and it was in perfect shape. Really fantastic, cosmetic, mechanical, everything. It was really nice. But there were a few cosmetic changes I wanted to make to the car to kind of personalize it. So I took it to Elite Finish, which is the best cosmetic shop in San Diego, by the way. They can do everything. They are not paying me to say this, but I love how this car turned out. Elite Finish, check them out. Anyway, I took it to them. They needed to order a couple of parts for the car. So they called the Audi dealer, and the Audi dealer informed them that there is no such car as an RS2. That doesn't exist. They said, well, let me give you the VIN and you can see. And they said, oh, huh, never knew. So the Audi dealer denied the existence of the car. So then I needed to do a few little mechanical things to it, have it looked at, give it a once over, even though it was in nice shape, just to be sure. So I called up an Audi shop in town that is known for being the best Audi shop in the San Diego area. And they said, yeah, we won't work on that. It's too old. And I said, well, it's an RS2. I said, no, our cutoff is 04. So you could drive in a 2005 A4 with a busted transmission and a sagging headliner and one headlight working, and they would work on that, but not the RS2, one of the most famous Audi models of all time. So shout out to North County Independent here in the San Diego area, who did agree to take a look at it. They gave it a thorough look over. It was in fantastic shape. They did a couple of minor things to it, nothing at all important, but they were ordering parts. They called a different Audi dealer here in the San Diego area, and that dealer informed them that, sir, there is no such car as the RS2. So 2 Audi dealers in my area have already denied the existence of this car. So as you can imagine, I'm a little bit nervous about servicing it if something important or major comes up. The good news is this engine, this 2.22 Turbo 5, is actually known for being pretty bulletproof, which is hard to say about an old Audi powertrain, but this one is well known. People get big miles out of them. People throw crazy turbos on them, and I suspect the engine won't really be my problem with this car. Powertrain, I should be okay, but I'm still worried about the other stuff, electrical, any gremlins that pop up, and bodywork, interior work. Parts aren't available, especially to North America. None of this stuff is easy to find, so I'm kind of on my own. I'm the only one in California with one of these, so it's definitely going to be a journey, but it's a journey I'm thrilled to be on, and I'm so excited to have this car. And so those are the quirks and features of my new 1994 Audi RS2 Avant. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the RS2. One of the things that I figured out very quickly in driving this car, there are only a couple of YouTube videos about the RS2, and it's journalists in the UK driving the Audi corporate RS2 that they've had all these years. And they're kind of touched. They're like, oh, it drives okay, not that great. But the thing about journalists is they're not used to driving older cars. They're always afraid to push them. And I'm not afraid to push my RS2, especially because I know it's in nice shape. One of the things I've learned quickly is it's actually a lot of fun if you beat the heck out of it, as you should. First and most importantly, this is the big one, turbocharger. This is an old school turbo car. 0 to 3,000 RPM, literally nothing happens in the slightest, not a thing. You put your foot down and you're like Honda Civic sort of situation. Above 3,000 RPM, it kicks you in the face like nothing else. Even like modern cars. I suspect between 3,000 and 6,000 RPM, this is faster than a lot of really serious modern cars. It just loses every race below 3,000, which is actually kind of funny because one of the things that a lot of people know about this car is back in the day, they used to say that this was faster 0 to 30 than a McLaren F1, and then the F1 would catch up. And I guess that was because this could do a great launch with all-wheel drive. So maybe you could lift up the revs a little bit and then dump the clutch and then just take off, and you didn't have to deal with the turbo lag, and that's how you could beat the F1. But I'll tell you, really getting on it, you feel that turbocharger. This car is quick. Now I admit it's not the nimblest car in the world. That's kind of, to me, its probably biggest drawback. The suspension is just not tremendous. I mean, it's an older car. Steering and handling is just not what it's gonna be for a modern vehicle. But even compared to some contemporaries, like the Delta Integrale, I drove that, loved how it drove, very more precise than this car. This car is a little bigger than that, so that makes sense, but ultimately it's just not quite the top handler from that era. But it is a fun car to drive. It handles reasonably well, it steers pretty well, and it's all hydraulic. It's a small, light kind of throw-around car. It's not quite as precise as I want, but it makes up for that with lightweight and tossability and no BS interference from different stuff. No excessive power. You're doing it yourself. You're revving it up, you're gearing down. That's the fun part. And when you gear down and really accelerate, it's eyes in the back of the head. I mean, it really, it hauls. Now, I want to pause for driving experience for a second and go back to pricing, because I mentioned earlier that I paid over $70,000 for this car, and that's true. And people in Europe are going to look at this and think that that is the craziest thing, because they remember when this was a cheap used car. There was a period before these became legal to move into the United States where these were selling for maybe 20, 25 would buy you a nice one. These days, things have changed. If you get an off color, like silver, there was a dark green, not the best colors. If you get one of those and it's got higher miles, you can still find one, and some of these have 200,000+ miles, so you can still find one in the 20s probably. But if you want a blue car, and if you want a really nice car, you gotta spend real money now. These are legal in the States. It's also lifted up in value by the Porsche tie-in, because everything Porsche is valuable right now, and these are just becoming importable, so Porsche fans are getting into them. You know, we had the Mercedes 500e in America, which was also built by Porsche. This car is a cooler, rarer, more special 500e with more Porsche-ness to it, frankly. And so that will also help its values. And I have to say, as expensive as this car was, I truly believe, I've owned 30 cars, I truly believe that this car, more than any other one I have ever bought, will go up in value more and more. It was the first Audi RS car, it was the first Nogaro blue car, it was the first high-performance station wagon, it has the Porsche connection, it's incredibly rare, it's incredibly special. This car will be worth serious, serious money one day. And even though I'm not in on the ground floor at $70,000+, I really think that this will not be a regret that I have that I bought this car for this kind of money. I only hope that it doesn't get so expensive that I worry about driving it. But anyway, back to driving it. Tossable, fun, light. It's also very stable at higher speeds. I've had this car already up to some pretty high Autobahn style speeds, very stable, dead straight, dead flat. This is a great example of this car. And last thing, I drive it around, and you know, I have my Ford GT. I drive that, and people are always looking and pointing, taking pictures. And even my G-Wagon convertible, people come up to me. This car is totally under the radar. Meanwhile, it's the car that I am probably most it's stunned. It would be most stunned to see. And so I'm driving past people, and I'm like, don't you realize what you're next to? The older Audi, I mean, there's just not a following for cars like this in the States. And so it's kind of interesting to be so underground. But car people will know this is the ultimate, the first, and a fast wagon, very special old Audi. And I'm totally thrilled with it. Thrilled with how it drives, thrilled with how it looks, and I'm so happy I own it. It's unbelievable to me. And so that's the 1994 Audi RS2 Avant. My 1994 Audi RS2 Avant. I can't tell you how excited this car makes me. I know it's just an old station wagon, but to a kid growing up, searching Wikipedia for cool cars, to me, it's the old station wagon. I have wanted this car pretty much since I found out about it, and I'm thrilled that I finally have it. And now it's time to give the RS2 Avant a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the RS2 is handsome. I love how it looks, wonderfully understated and well proportioned. It gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds, so it gets a 6 out of 10. Handling is fine, pretty good, but not super sharp or incredibly spry, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is decent. It's fast, but ultimately it's a bit more of a mature fast car than, say, the Delta Integrale, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, cool factor. To enthusiasts who know what this is amazingly cool. This car was so many firsts. But to
everyone else it's just a car, so it gets a respectable 7 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 30 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The RS2 is fine, but not exactly well equipped, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Comfort is fine, nothing special, nothing bad, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality, the interior is reasonably nice with good materials, but reliability is absolutely a fear with any older Audi, but especially one with such unobtainable parts, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Practicality is excellent given its 4 doors and station wagon cargo area, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, value, and I really think these are an excellent one. I truly think they're undervalued and they'll go up considerably, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 27 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 57 out of 100, which places it here against relevant cars. Like most fast wagons, the RS2 scores really well, losing out only to the Delta Integrale in this segment. The Delta has a much higher weekend score, but the RS2 is more practical. I seriously considered getting a Delta, but I decided the RS2 would be more reliable and easier to work on. Overall, the RS2 is a fantastic car, and it's likely to get more and more attention as it's now legal to import to the US.